George Miller sat alone in his kitchen, the dim light above the table casting a yellow glow across the chipped linoleum that had seen better days. At 68, he had grown used to the silence, to the way the refrigerator hummed louder than his own thoughts, to the absence of another chair pulled close beside him. He would sometimes catch himself setting 2 coffee mugs in the morning, one for him and one for Linda, before remembering she had been gone for 5 years now, cancer stealing her breath while he had watched helplessly, powerless to stop it. Tonight, though, he wasn't drinking coffee. He sat with the television on, his glasses perched low on his nose, the local news anchor's voice filling the emptiness. Most nights the news was the same, politics, crime, weather, but this time something different flickered across the screen. The anchor spoke with unusual excitement, introducing a clip that had already gone viral, Elon Musk's rocket landing. George blinked, leaned forward, adjusted his glasses. He watched as fire and smoke roared beneath the towering cylinder, watched the impossible happen as the rocket slowed, steadied, and touched down on its launch pad as if guided by an invisible hand. The crowd on the broadcast erupted, cheers and applause, but George remained frozen, his breath shallow. He whispered without thinking, "Reusable rockets? At my age, I can barely reuse myself." The words tasted bitter, tinged with humor and self-loathing all at once. For the past decade he had felt less like a man and more like an object gathering dust, a relic of the factory where he had spent his life laboring until his body broke down. Retirement hadn't been a choice, not really, it was forced after his back surgery and the downsizing. Since then, the days had bled together. His children rarely called, his son telling him to take it easy, his daughter sending polite texts from California. George carried his grief like a stone in his chest, heavy and unshakable. But as the rocket stood proudly on the screen, flames extinguished, smoke curling around its legs, something cracked open inside him, small but undeniable. He remembered being a boy lying in the backyard grass of his childhood home, staring at the stars through a telescope he had built with his own hands. He remembered the thrill of pointing it toward the moon, the joy of imagining a future that stretched beyond Earth. For a moment, he was 12 again, filled with possibility, his heart pounding with the same wonder he saw in those SpaceX engineers hugging one another in triumph. The anchor's voice broke his trance, reciting facts. The rocket had landed safely, marking a milestone in American space exploration, proving that the impossible could become possible. George heard none of it. He sat back in his chair, his fingers trembling slightly, eyes still fixed on the fading image of the rocket standing tall against the night sky. He whispered again, softer this time, as though to himself, "If rockets can come back, maybe I can too." He chuckled, shaking his head at the absurdity. But the seed had been planted. He turned off the television and sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator returning as his only companion. Yet silence didn't feel the same now. His mind buzzed with questions he hadn't allowed himself to think in years. What if aging wasn't just decline? What if he had been wrong to believe his best days were behind him? What if there was still a chance, however small, to feel alive again? His heart argued with his head. The rational side of him whispered that he was too old, too tired, too broken. But the boy who had once built a telescope out of scrap wood and cardboard lenses whispered back, louder than before, that maybe he wasn't finished yet. He stood slowly, his knees creaking, and shuffled to the back door. The night air was crisp, carrying the smell of autumn leaves. Above him, the sky stretched wide and endless, sprinkled with stars. He squinted, trying to find Mars, trying to remember the constellations he used to know by heart. He thought of Elon Musk, a man younger than him but still gray at the temples, standing on a stage and declaring that humanity would become a spacefaring species. George didn't know whether Musk was a genius, a madman, or both, but he envied the audacity. He envied the courage to look at the impossible and say, "Let's try anyway." He whispered into the night, as if Linda might hear him from wherever she was, "Do you think it's too late for me?" The only reply was the rustle of leaves. Back inside, George found a notepad in the drawer where Linda used to keep coupons. He uncapped a pen and scribbled down a sentence he half remembered Musk saying in some interview: "The future is built by those who refuse to quit, even when the odds are impossible." George stared at the words, tracing them with his finger as though they held some secret power. He didn't know what he would do with them, but he knew he needed them. They felt like oxygen in a room that had been suffocating him for years. The night dragged on, and sleep didn't come easily. His mind replayed the rocket landing over and over, the roar, the fire, the impossible descent, and the stillness when it touched the ground. It became a metaphor he couldn't escape. Rockets were built to be destroyed, everyone used to say. One launch, one explosion, then scrap. But Musk had dared to imagine something different, that they could rise again. George rolled over in bed, staring at the ceiling. Wasn't he, in a way, like those rockets? Everyone, including himself, had assumed he was finished. Used up. Past his prime. But what if he could rise again? He laughed at the thought, shaking his head, muttering, "You're an old fool, George." Yet beneath the self-mockery, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. The next morning, George sat with his coffee, staring at the notepad. He touched the words again, his fingers trembling slightly. "The future is built by those who refuse to quit." He said it aloud, testing the weight of the sentence on his tongue. It felt foreign, yet familiar, like a language he had once spoken fluently but had long forgotten. He wondered what his children would think if they knew their father was scribbling down Elon Musk quotes like a teenager with a poster on his wall. His son would probably roll his eyes, tell him to relax, remind him that he was too old to dream. But George didn't call his son, didn't seek approval. Instead, he wandered into the garage, a place he hadn't truly entered in years. Dust coated everything. Boxes of old tools, paint cans, Linda's gardening supplies. In the corner, beneath a tarp, sat the telescope he had built when he was 16. He pulled the tarp away, coughing as dust rose into the air. The telescope looked sad, rust creeping along the edges, its once polished lenses clouded with grime. He ran a hand over it, and for the first time in years, he smiled. It was broken, yes, but not gone. Reusable, he thought. Like a rocket. The moment stretched, heavy and meaningful. He knew then that something had shifted inside him. It wasn't a plan yet, not a roadmap. But it was a spark. And sometimes, a spark was enough. He whispered into the dusty air, "Maybe it's not too late." Outside, the autumn sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the driveway. George stood in the doorway of his garage, telescope in hand, feeling the weight of both years and possibilities pressing against his chest. The hum of the refrigerator no longer seemed so loud. The silence of the house no longer seemed so final. Something had changed, and though he couldn't yet name it, he knew it was real. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? George awoke the next morning with an unusual heaviness in his chest, not the heaviness of dread that had hung over him for years but something different, something closer to anticipation, though he did not yet understand it. He moved slowly as always, joints stiff, knees creaking, but there was a spark in his mind that refused to dim. The image of the rocket landing still replayed behind his eyes like a memory from a dream he could not shake. He poured himself coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the notepad where he had written Musk's words the night before. The sentence looked awkward in his shaky handwriting, uneven letters drifting across the page, but it seemed to breathe with a life of its own. He traced the ink with his finger, whispering to himself again, "The future is built by those who refuse to quit." The phrase pulled at something deep inside him, something he hadn't dared touch in decades. His gaze shifted to the window, to the faint light rising above the rooftops of his quiet Ohio neighborhood. For years his mornings had followed the same pattern: coffee, silence, maybe the newspaper if it arrived on time, then hours of television or idle tinkering around the house before the long stretch of afternoon solitude. Life had become a slow drip of monotony, as if the world had moved on without him and left him stranded. But this morning felt different. The words on the page demanded reflection, and reflection carried him backward into the shadows of his own past, to the boy he had been long before factory floors and back injuries and funerals. He remembered standing in the small backyard of his childhood home in the summer of 1965, a boy with bright eyes and endless curiosity. His father had brought home a box of scrap wood and metal from the machine shop where he worked, and George had spent weeks hammering, sawing, and screwing pieces together until a telescope began to take shape. He had saved up for the lenses, mowing lawns and delivering newspapers until he had enough to buy them from a mail-order catalog. The day the package arrived he had nearly run down the mailman with excitement, tearing it open and holding the glass carefully, reverently, as though it were treasure. He had built the telescope by hand, every bolt, every hinge, every tiny adjustment knob crafted with the stubborn patience of youth. When he pointed it to the sky that first clear night, his heart had thundered as the moon leapt into focus, craters sharp and silver against the darkness. He had called out for his mother and father to come see, his voice cracking with joy, and for a brief shining moment the world had felt limitless. That telescope had been more than an object, it had been a symbol of possibility, of the boy he once was and the man he had hoped to become. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. College had been too expensive, and his father had insisted he take the job at the factory, a job that paid steady wages and offered health insurance. George had told himself it would be temporary, that he would work for a few years, save money, then go back to school for engineering. But then he met Linda, with her warm laugh and eyes that seemed to see through every defense he had. They married young, bought a small house, and before long came the children. College faded further into the distance with every passing year, every shift on the factory floor, every bill that had to be paid. By the time George turned 30, the telescope sat in the garage collecting dust, and his dreams of designing machines that might reach for the stars had been packed away, buried beneath responsibility. He didn't resent it, not at first. Linda was his light, and the kids brought joy that softened the edges of regret. But deep down, a small voice had always whispered, reminding him of the boy who once believed he might touch the heavens. Over time that voice grew fainter, drowned out by the grind of daily life, until it was little more than an echo he ignored. The factory years stretched long and hard. The machines roared, the air smelled of oil and sweat, and his back bore the punishment of endless repetition. He became skilled, respected, but never fulfilled. Nights at home were simple, dinner with Linda, homework with the kids, maybe a movie on the couch. He learned to accept that dreams were for other people. People who could afford them, people who didn't have mouths to feed or mortgages to pay. And then, suddenly, it was over. Retirement had come not as a choice but as a sentence. His back surgery left him unable to lift, unable to stand for hours, and the company had no place for men who slowed the line. He remembered the day they handed him the papers, the way his hands shook, the way he smiled weakly and pretended he was ready to rest, though inside he felt gutted. When Linda passed just a few years later, the house grew unbearably quiet. The children were grown and gone, their lives busy, their calls infrequent. George filled the silence with television, with idle routines, with half-hearted attempts at hobbies that never stuck. He told himself he was too tired, too old, too broken to chase anything new. Yet that wasn't the whole truth. The deeper truth was that he was afraid. Afraid to try, afraid to fail, afraid to hope again only to be reminded that time had stolen his chance. That fear became his cage, invisible but unyielding, and for years he lived inside it, convincing himself it was safety. Now, as he sat in his kitchen staring at Musk's words, he wondered if the cage had been self-imposed all along. He thought of Linda, of how she used to tell him he underestimated himself, how she believed he could have done anything if only he had dared. He remembered her smile, her faith in him, and felt a pang of guilt for letting her down, for letting himself down. He closed his eyes and saw the rocket again, flame stabilizing it as it touched down, defying gravity, defying expectation. He whispered, "Reusable," as though the word itself could heal something inside him. His life, too, had been launched once, spent, and discarded, or so he had believed. But what if he could reclaim it? What if there was still fuel left, still purpose waiting to ignite? The thought scared him as much as it thrilled him. He rose from the table and walked into the living room, glancing at the framed photographs on the mantel. There was Linda, forever smiling, frozen in time. There were the children, young and innocent, before distance and years had grown between them. And there was George himself, decades younger, holding the telescope proudly on the night he had finished it. He stared at that boy in the photograph, a boy with messy hair and wide eyes, and felt tears sting his own. "Where did you go?" he whispered to the image. The boy did not answer, but the rocket in his mind did, whispering in its fiery descent, "I came back." George wiped his eyes, embarrassed though no one was there to see. He returned to the garage and stood over the old telescope, tracing its edges with his hands. He remembered how carefully he had once built it, how precise he had been, how every piece had mattered. It was broken now, yes, but not beyond repair. He thought again of Musk, of the engineers who had refused to believe rockets must always be disposable. To himself, to the universe, "I thought it was the end. Maybe it's just the beginning." And though the garage remained quiet, though the night outside was still and indifferent, George felt as though the stars themselves leaned closer, listening. George sat at the kitchen table the next evening, staring at the notepad as though the words scribbled there might suddenly arrange themselves into a plan, a roadmap that could tell him where to go next. But there was no plan, only the echo of Elon Musk's voice he had watched online earlier that day: "You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." The sentence lingered, gnawed at him, but so did the chorus of doubts that rose inside his head. Wasn't he already too old? Wasn't 68 long past the age of starting anything new? He had lived his whole life following rules: work hard, pay bills, raise a family, and now those years were gone, spent like a rocket's fuel. He looked around his quiet kitchen and wondered who would even care if he tried to do something more. His son certainly wouldn't. Michael had called just last week, their conversation short and efficient, the way his son always spoke when distracted by work. "Dad, you should slow down," he had said when George mentioned feeling restless. "You've earned your rest. Don't push yourself." It was meant kindly, but it had landed like a dismissal, a quiet way of saying that his time of usefulness was finished. His daughter, Claire, wasn't much different. She lived thousands of miles away in California, working long hours at a tech firm, her voice cheerful but distant whenever she did call. She hadn't been back to Ohio in nearly 3 years. George couldn't blame her, she had her own life to live, but the gap between them weighed heavily on him, a reminder of how easily parents fade into the background once children build lives of their own. Even his doctor echoed the same sentiment. "At your age, George, it's important to avoid unnecessary strain. Your back can't handle much. Gentle walks, light activity, that's enough. Don't push for more." The words felt like shackles, a prescription not just for his health but for his entire existence: stay quiet, stay safe, don't dare. Sitting in that kitchen, George clenched his fists. A war raged inside him, one side insisting it was too late, the other side whispering that maybe it wasn't. He turned on his laptop and searched for Musk speeches, clicking on one where the man stood in front of a crowded hall, speaking with the intensity of someone who refused to accept the limits others had handed him. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. George leaned closer to the screen, his heart beating faster. He could almost hear the words directed at him personally, as if Musk were looking through the camera, past the years, straight into his soul. He wrote that line on his notepad too, then sat back, staring at the page where 2 sentences now shone like defiant flames against the darkness of his doubt. But almost immediately, the other voice rose up: "What's important enough in your life, George? You're not building rockets. You're not sending people to Mars. You're a man with a broken back and a broken telescope." The thought stung, and for a moment he felt foolish, like a child pretending at greatness. He shut the laptop and rubbed his eyes, exhausted by the battle inside him. That night, sleep was restless. He dreamed of rockets failing, exploding in fire, pieces scattering across the sky. In the dream he saw himself among the wreckage, old and bent, holding the shattered pieces of his telescope. He woke with sweat on his brow, breathing hard, and the war inside him grew louder. Was trying again worth the pain of inevitable failure? Days passed in a haze of conflict. Each morning he walked into the garage, stared at the telescope, touched its rusted frame, and each time he hesitated, afraid to begin. The voice of doubt told him he would break it beyond repair, that he would only humiliate himself if anyone found out what he was doing. Yet the spark refused to die. On Sunday he went to church for the first time in months, more out of habit than conviction. He sat in the back pew, listening to the pastor talk about faith and resilience, about how even in the twilight years there could be renewal. The words were meant for everyone, but George felt them pierce him directly. After the service, an old neighbor, Tom, patted him on the back. "How you holding up, George? Still keeping busy?" George smiled weakly and muttered, "Trying," but inside he wanted to scream. Busy with what? With waiting to die? With watching the world pass by on a glowing screen? That afternoon he sat on his porch, the autumn air crisp, the trees painted with orange and red. Kids rode bikes down the street, laughing, their voices rising into the cool air. He envied them, their energy, their unshakable belief that life stretched infinitely ahead. He wondered when he had stopped believing that for himself. As he sat, he pulled out his phone and opened a clip from Musk's early SpaceX days. The video showed a rocket exploding spectacularly, debris flying across the ocean. Reporters asked him afterward if he was discouraged, if this failure meant the end. Musk, calm and unfazed, had smiled and said, "This is just one step closer. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." George replayed that line again and again, the words colliding with his doubts. Failure as progress, not defeat. It was the exact opposite of everything he had been taught his whole life, where failure was shameful, final, something to be hidden. He thought of the times he had failed, dropping out of his dream of college, failing to keep the telescope alive, failing to keep close ties with his children. Each failure had weighed him down, convinced him to stop trying. But what if each failure could have been a step instead of a wall? The idea was intoxicating and terrifying. That night he sat again at the table, scribbling furiously in his notepad, "Failure is progress. Rockets fall, then rise." He circled the words, underlined them, trying to etch them into his stubborn mind. Yet even as he wrote, his phone buzzed. A text from Michael, "Dad, don't overdo anything, okay? We don't want you hurting yourself again." George stared at the message, torn between gratitude and resentment. His son meant well, he knew that. But the words felt like another chain, another reminder that no one believed he could do more than survive. He didn't reply. Instead, he pushed the phone aside and gripped the pen tighter. He muttered to himself, "I'm not done. Not yet." The war inside him grew fiercer with each passing day, like two armies clashing endlessly without victory. On one side stood the weight of years, the warnings of doctors, the dismissals of his children, the voice that told him he was too old to matter. On the other side flickered the spark ignited by a rocket landing, by words scrawled in a notebook, by memories of a boy who once reached for the stars. He could feel the decision building inside him, pressing against the walls of his fear. Soon he would have to choose which voice to follow. One night, restless, he went outside and looked up at the sky. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the black canvas of night, indifferent to the struggles of an old man. Yet as he stared, he felt something stir again, wonder, awe, a reminder that the universe did not measure life by years lived but by curiosity pursued. He whispered into the darkness, "Is it too late for me?" And though no answer came, he felt as though the silence itself dared him to find out. He clenched his fists, standing taller despite the ache in his back, and made himself a quiet vow. He didn't know what form it would take, didn't know how much strength he had left, but he would no longer surrender to the cage. He would test himself, risk failure, and see if rockets weren't the only things that could rise again. The war was not over, but for the first time he felt the tide shifting. He turned back toward the garage, where the telescope waited like an unfinished dream, and in his heart he knew the next battle would be fought there. George had spent the better part of the week circling the garage like a man approaching a battlefield, stepping in only to stare at the broken telescope before retreating again. He would run his hand across the rusted tube, examine the cracked mount, then back away with excuses muttered under his breath about sore joints, bad light, not enough tools. Yet every evening when the news played, rockets flashed across the screen, and every clip reignited the restlessness burning inside him. One Friday night he brewed a late cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop. His finger hovered over the trackpad before he finally typed into the search bar, SpaceX landing full video. What filled the screen was something he had seen in bits and pieces before, but never in its entirety. The video began with the countdown, the deep voice echoing numbers as if summoning destiny. George leaned forward, elbows on the table, his heart thumping as the rocket engines roared to life. Flames erupted, smoke billowed, and the massive machine lifted off the pad with a ferocity that made his bones vibrate even through the screen. He imagined what it must feel like to be there in person, the ground trembling beneath his feet, the air thick with the smell of fuel and fire, the sound so loud it threatened to split the sky. For minutes he watched the rocket ascend, his breath held as though he too were climbing higher and higher, leaving Earth behind. Then came the part he had almost forgotten, the descent. He remembered the world's skepticism, how people had laughed when Musk first suggested rockets could land themselves. Impossible, they said. Too risky, too costly, too absurd. Yet here it was unfolding before his eyes. The camera tracked the booster as it fell back toward Earth, engines reigniting, flames streaming out like the breath of a dragon. George's hand trembled on the coffee cup as the rocket tilted, adjusted, steadied. It looked awkward, precarious, like a man learning to walk on stilts. The closer it came to the landing pad, the tighter George's chest became. He whispered, come on, as though his encouragement could cross the years and miles to push it safely home. And then it happened. With a final burst of flame the booster touched down, legs deploying, smoke swirling in every direction. For a moment it wobbled, a giant balancing on tiptoes, before locking firmly into place. The cameras zoomed in on the impossible image, a rocket, not destroyed, not wasted, but standing proudly, ready to be used again. George's mouth fell open. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He pushed back his chair and stood, heart racing as if he himself had achieved the landing. They did it, he whispered into the empty kitchen. They actually did it. The cheers from the SpaceX control room echoed through the speakers, men and women hugging, clapping, some crying openly. George felt a lump rise in his throat, not because he knew any of them, but because he knew what it meant to defy every doubter, every limitation, and prove the impossible possible. For a long time he stood frozen, watching the replay again and again. Each time the rocket steadied and touched down, the spark in his chest grew hotter. He saw in that moment a reflection of himself, of his life that had been written off, considered spent, impossible to reuse. Yet here was proof that discarded things could rise again. The thought crashed through him with the force of revelation, if rockets could come back, maybe so could he. He turned off the video and walked into the garage, unable to resist the pull any longer. The smell of dust and old wood filled his nostrils as he pulled the tarp from the telescope once more. He ran his fingers along its cold frame, whispering, "You're my rocket." He dragged the stool closer and sat, examining it with new eyes. The rust was bad, the mount crooked, the lenses clouded, but beneath the decay was the same telescope he had built as a boy. He could almost see his younger self hunched over it, tools scattered around, Linda watching from the porch with an indulgent smile. He felt the years collapse in on themselves, time folding like paper, until he was no longer a widower in his garage but a boy chasing stars. His hands shook as he lifted one of the lenses to the light. The glass was dirty, but not shattered. He rubbed it gently with the hem of his shirt until the grime began to clear. The simple act filled him with a rush of energy. He whispered again, "If rockets can come back, maybe I can too." The words no longer sounded ridiculous. They sounded like a promise. Over the following nights he made it a ritual. After dinner he would retreat to the garage, clean another piece, adjust another bolt, wipe away another layer of neglect. His back ached and his knees protested, but he ignored the pain, focusing instead on the satisfaction of progress. Each small repair felt like a landing of its own, shaky at first, but steady once complete. One evening, as he tightened a screw, his phone buzzed with a call from Michael. He hesitated before answering, not wanting to break his momentum. "Hey Dad," his son's voice came through, casual, distracted. "Just checking in. You doing okay?" George glanced at the telescope, then said carefully, "I've been working on something." "Oh yeah? What kind of something?" Michael asked, clearly only half listening. George hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. "I've been fixing up the telescope. The one I built when I was a kid." There was a pause on the line, then a chuckle. "Dad, you really think that's a good idea? I mean, with your back and everything?" The words hit like a splash of cold water, but George forced a calm reply. "It gives me something to do. Something to look forward to." Michael sighed. "Just don't overdo it, okay? You don't want to hurt yourself." They talked a few more minutes before hanging up, and though the conversation was ordinary, George couldn't shake the sting of doubt. Still, when he looked at the telescope again, he felt defiance rise. He muttered, "They said rockets couldn't land either." That night, instead of discouragement, his son's skepticism fueled him further. He replayed the landing video once more, watching the flames steady the rocket, the impossible descent turning into triumph, and he told himself he too would land, no matter how shaky the process. One weekend, curious neighbors peeked into his garage. Mrs. Henderson from across the street called out, "George, what are you up to in there?" He smiled sheepishly, wiping grease from his hands. "Just fixing an old friend." She squinted. "That old telescope? Thought you'd thrown it out years ago." "Not yet," he said with a grin. "Turns out, some things can still surprise you." She laughed and shook her head, muttering something about, "Next thing you know, George will be flying to Mars." He laughed too, but when she walked away, he whispered under his breath, "Maybe not Mars. But maybe somewhere." As days turned into weeks, the telescope began to resemble its former self. The mount stood straighter, the rust scraped away, the lenses clearer. Each improvement mirrored a change in George himself. He felt lighter, more awake. The silence of the house no longer pressed down on him like a weight. Even the loneliness of Linda's absence felt softer, as though she were watching from somewhere, proud of his persistence. One night, after tightening the final bolt, he wheeled the telescope out into the backyard. The air was crisp, the stars sharp and brilliant against the dark sky. He positioned the telescope carefully, breath quickening as he adjusted the focus. For a moment the image was blurry, distorted by dust he had missed, but then it sharpened, and there it was, the moon, glowing and magnificent, every crater etched in perfect clarity. George gasped, his hands gripping the sides of the telescope. Tears welled in his eyes. "Hello, old friend," he whispered to the moon. He felt 12 years old again, full of wonder and hope. He stood there for a long time, gazing at the heavens, the war inside him momentarily silenced. For the first time in years, he believed not only in rockets but in himself. He believed that even the impossible could land safely if you dared to try. George woke up earlier than usual the next morning, long before the sun had risen, the image of the moon still vivid in his mind. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the shadows cast by the blinds across the carpet, and felt a quiet hum of energy running through his veins. It wasn't just the telescope, it was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He slipped on his shoes, grabbed a jacket, and stepped outside into the cool pre-dawn air. The street was silent, the world still asleep, but above him stretched a sky filled with stars. He inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs, and felt stronger than he had in a long while. On impulse he decided to walk, just to see how far he could go. His neighborhood was small, the sidewalks cracked in places, but as his feet hit the pavement in a steady rhythm, George felt a surprising lightness. His knees creaked, his back ached, but each step felt like defiance. For years he had told himself he couldn't push too hard, couldn't risk injury, couldn't do more than shuffle from kitchen to living room. But now, with every footfall, he remembered the landing of that rocket, wobbling yet steady, and thought, if that can stand, so can I. He walked to the end of the block, then another, until the houses gave way to a small park with a wooden bench. By then his breath was heavy, his heart pounding, but instead of feeling defeated, he felt alive. He sat for a moment, catching his breath, watching the horizon lighten with the first hint of dawn. Small step, he whispered, recalling the famous words from Apollo. But still a step. When he returned home, sweat dampened his shirt, but his spirit was unshaken. He brewed himself coffee, sat by the kitchen window, and smiled at the telescope sitting proudly in the yard. That day marked the beginning of a new habit. Every morning he walked, sometimes only a block, sometimes farther, depending on how his body felt. At first it was slow, careful, every movement monitored with suspicion, but soon he began to trust himself more. He noticed small changes, his breathing came easier, his steps grew steadier, his balance improved. It wasn't miraculous, but it was enough. Enough to prove that age was not a full stop, only a comma. One evening, after another walk, George sat with his notebook. He hadn't written in years, not since Linda passed, but he felt compelled to capture what he was experiencing. The words spilled awkwardly at first, his hands stiff and unused to the motion, but soon sentences formed, crooked but sincere. Today I walked farther than yesterday. Today I saw the sun rise and it felt like the world was new again. I'm not finished yet. He closed the notebook with trembling hands, a strange mix of embarrassment and pride bubbling inside him. The next day, during a phone call with Michael, he nearly mentioned it. Instead he said casually, I've been walking in the mornings. Michael paused. Really? That's good, Dad. Just don't overdo it, all right? George smiled softly. It was the same refrain, the same caution, but for once it didn't discourage him. Instead, it reminded him of how everyone once told Musk not to try, how they said failure was certain. Yet Musk had ignored them. Why shouldn't he? He began to listen more closely to Elon's interviews, not just about rockets but about mindset. He scribbled down quotes that struck him: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Or, failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough. George read them aloud to himself, sometimes during walks, sometimes late at night in the garage, as though reciting prayers. They became mantras that drowned out the voices of doubt. His neighbors noticed the change. Mrs. Henderson, walking her dog one morning, stopped and said, "You're out here early, George. Looks like you've lost some weight." He chuckled, patting his stomach. Maybe a pound or two. Or maybe I just stand taller these days. She smiled, then continued down the street, but her words lingered. For years he had felt invisible, a man fading into the background, but now people were noticing again. It made him walk a little farther that morning. Weeks turned into a rhythm: repair work on the telescope in the evenings, morning walks at dawn, scribbled notes in the notebook whenever inspiration struck. His life, once quiet and gray, began to feel painted in new colors. Yet with progress came doubt. One morning, after a longer walk, his knee flared with sharp pain, forcing him to limp home. He collapsed into a chair, wincing, fear gnawing at him. What if I've pushed too far? What if this is the end of it? For hours he sat in silence, staring at the floor, the old questions creeping back. Was it foolish to think he could change? Was he just setting himself up for disappointment? That evening he almost skipped the telescope, almost let it sit untouched, but something made him turn on the laptop instead. He found another SpaceX clip, this one showing not a landing but a failure. The rocket toppled, engulfed in flames, debris scattering across the pad. He expected to feel discouraged, but then he noticed the faces of the engineers. They weren't devastated, they were already taking notes, already analyzing, already preparing for the next attempt. Musk's voiceover played in the clip, "You want to have failures along the way. If things are not failing, you're not learning." George leaned back, his heart pounding with realization. His knee pain wasn't the end. It was part of the process. A stumble, not a conclusion. He whispered, "If rockets can explode and still fly again, then so can I." He iced his knee, rested for 2 days, then started walking again, slower, shorter, but determined. The setback made the steps sweeter. Each one was earned through resilience. His notebook filled with entries. Pain does not mean stop. Pain means adjust. Every rocket that fails teaches them something. Every step that hurts teaches me too. Slowly, almost without realizing it, George began to share pieces of this new life. One afternoon his daughter Emily called, her voice warm and curious. "Dad, Michael told me you've been walking. Is that true?" George smiled. "It is. Every morning. Some days more than others." Emily laughed gently. "That's amazing. I'm proud of you." The words hit him like sunlight breaking through clouds. For years he had longed for connection, for someone to notice, to care. And now, with just a few small steps, the walls between him and his children seemed thinner. He wanted to tell her more, about the telescope, the notebook, the spark he felt, but he decided to wait. Some things needed to be shown, not told. That night he stood again in the backyard with the telescope aimed at Jupiter. He adjusted the focus, and when the planet came into view, its moons faintly visible, he felt a surge of awe. He whispered, "Linda, I wish you could see this." In the silence that followed, he almost imagined her voice, "You're not done yet, George. You're still landing." The thought filled him with warmth. He realized then that this journey wasn't just about walking or fixing telescopes. It was about proving, to himself and to the world, that age was not an erasure. That small steps, taken with courage, could rewrite a legacy. He closed his eyes and repeated the mantra that had carried him this far, "If rockets can come back, maybe so can I." And with that, he knew the first steps were only the beginning. George's momentum carried him through the following weeks, each morning walk and each night with the telescope carving out a new rhythm that made him feel as if his life had shifted onto a new orbit. Yet as his confidence grew, so did the attention of others, and not all of it was encouraging. One Sunday afternoon Michael stopped by unexpectedly, his car pulling into the driveway with a crunch of gravel. George was in the garage tinkering with the telescope mount when he heard the familiar sound and felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. He hadn't seen his son in person for months. Michael stepped out of the car, looking crisp in a polo shirt and jeans, his hair neatly trimmed, his expression already carrying the weight of skepticism. "Dad," he said, walking up the drive, "what are you doing in here?" George smiled and wiped his hands on a rag. "Fixing her up. She's almost ready for stargazing again." Michael's eyes darted to the telescope, his brows furrowing. "That old thing. I thought it was just junk." "Not junk," George replied, firm but calm. "Just waiting for a second chance." Michael sighed, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. "Dad, you've got to be careful. At your age, messing around with heavy stuff, tools, sharp edges, it's risky. You could hurt yourself. The words stung, though George had half expected them. He forced a smile. I know you worry. But I'm careful. This gives me something worth waking up for. Michael shook his head. I just don't want you to get carried away. You should be resting, enjoying retirement. Not, rebuilding science projects from your childhood. For a moment George felt his confidence falter. The telescope suddenly looked less like a triumph and more like a child's toy, fragile and silly. But then he remembered the rocket landing, remembered the impossible flame balancing steel, and the doubt in Michael's tone turned into fuel. He straightened. You know what, son? Resting is what almost buried me. This is what's keeping me alive. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it, his expression torn between concern and confusion. I don't get it, Dad. What's the point? George met his eyes steadily. The point is, I'm not finished. Not yet. Silence stretched between them before Michael finally muttered, just, be careful, and turned the conversation to safer topics. They ate dinner together, polite and restrained, but the unspoken tension lingered. Later that night, after Michael left, George sat by the telescope and whispered, they don't see it yet. But they will. The very next day, his neighbor's grandson, a teenager named Ethan, wandered over while George was adjusting the eyepiece. Hey, Mr. G, Ethan said, shoving his hands in his hoodie pockets. What ya working on? George explained about the telescope, showing him the gears and lenses. Ethan's eyes widened. That's sick. Can you actually see planets with it? George grinned, the boy's enthusiasm washing away the residue of Michael's doubt. Stick around tonight. I'll show you Jupiter. That evening Ethan returned, dragging his skeptical friend Tyler. When George positioned the telescope and let them take turns peering through it, their reactions filled him with joy. No way, Tyler exclaimed. You can actually see the moons. Ethan laughed. Mr. G, you're like a space wizard or something. George chuckled, heart swelling. For years he had been invisible, his wisdom gathering dust like the telescope itself. Now, to these boys, he was suddenly someone worth listening to. Their wonder mirrored his own, and in their awe he felt validated. Yet even as moments like these lifted him, the voices of doubt circled closer. At church one morning, a well-meaning friend clasped his shoulder and said, George, I hear you've been out walking and fiddling with that telescope. Don't push yourself too hard, all right? You don't want to end up in the hospital. At the grocery store, another acquaintance muttered, at our age, best thing to do is take it easy. Everywhere he turned, people seemed intent on reminding him of his fragility, as though his years were nothing more than a caution sign. At first he laughed it off, but gradually the chorus of doubt seeped into his bones. One evening, after yet another comment about being too old for this nonsense, George found himself sitting in the dark garage, staring at the telescope without touching it. The silence pressed down, and for a moment he felt foolish. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was just a phase, a desperate grasp at youth. Maybe he should stop before he embarrassed himself further. He sat there for hours, paralyzed, until his laptop chimed with a notification. A new video had been posted, a clip of Elon Musk speaking at a conference. Almost mechanically, George opened it. Musk's voice filled the room, steady and unapologetic. When people tell you something is impossible, what they really mean is that they can't imagine it. But imagination is what changes the world. George froze, the words hitting him like a thunderclap. He replayed the sentence, scribbled it down in his notebook, read it aloud again and again. Impossible, they can't imagine it. But imagination is what changes the world. His chest tightened with emotion, tears threatening to spill. He whispered, they can't imagine me changing either. But that doesn't mean I can't. The doubt lifted like a fog. He stood, hands firm on the telescope, and tightened the last adjustment. The voices outside could shout all they wanted, but inside he carried a fire they could not extinguish. The next morning, during his walk, he pushed himself farther than before. His knee ached, his breath came hard, but he kept repeating Musk's words under his breath: imagination changes the world. Neighbors saw him, some offering polite nods, others whispering to each other, but he no longer cared. Every step was proof, not for them but for himself. A week later, Ethan returned with a small group of friends, curious about the telescope. George welcomed them eagerly, showing them Saturn's rings this time. The kids gasped, their laughter ringing through the night air. One of them pulled out a phone and snapped a picture of George with the telescope, posting it online with the caption, "Mr. G is cooler than half the internet." George chuckled when Ethan showed him the post, not realizing how far it might spread. Within days, the photo had gathered dozens of comments from local kids, many expressing surprise and admiration. Some even asked if George could show them the stars too. For the first time in years, people weren't seeing him as frail or finished. They were seeing him as someone with knowledge, passion, and purpose. When Michael called again, George mentioned the kids casually. There was silence on the line before Michael finally said, "Huh. Didn't think they'd care about stuff like that." George smiled. "They care more than you think. Sometimes they just need someone to open the door." Michael's tone softened. "Well, good for you, Dad." It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in the wall between them. Yet George knew the road ahead would still be filled with doubters, maybe even his own children. But he no longer feared their voices. Each doubt was simply another challenge, another reason to imagine bigger. That night, standing under the stars, he looked up at the vast sky and whispered, "If rockets can land, then so can I. No matter who doubts me." He felt the weight of years on his shoulders, but also the lift of defiance in his heart. For every doubter at the gate, there was a universe beyond it waiting to be explored, and he intended to walk through, one step at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The night Ethan posted the picture of George beside his telescope, George thought little of it, brushing off the moment as just another example of teenagers glued to their screens. But within days something shifted. When he walked down the street for his morning routine, a young girl he had never met waved from her porch and called, "Hey, spaceman." He chuckled, lifting a hand in greeting, though inside his heart thudded with surprise. Later that afternoon, while picking up groceries, the cashier, barely 20, smiled and said, "You're the guy with the telescope, right? My cousin showed me a video of Saturn you took. That's awesome." George blinked, mumbling a polite thank you, though he hadn't realized Ethan had filmed through the eyepiece. The world felt suddenly smaller, his quiet backyard stargazing reaching farther than he ever imagined. That evening when Ethan stopped by, George asked, "Son, did you share a video of the telescope?" Ethan grinned sheepishly. "Yeah. People loved it, Mr. G. They couldn't believe someone around here had that kind of setup. Some kids even messaged me asking if they could come check it out." George laughed in disbelief. "All for an old man's hobby?" Ethan shook his head. "Not a hobby. Inspiration. You're showing people that you don't have to be young to do something cool. You're like, proof that dreams don't expire." The words sank deep, warming George more than he cared to admit. Dreams don't expire. He repeated it later, scribbling the phrase in his notebook until the letters looked like they were etched into stone. That weekend, George agreed to host a small, stargazing night, for Ethan and a handful of friends. He spent the afternoon cleaning the telescope, setting up chairs, and brewing a pot of cocoa. As dusk fell, kids trickled into his yard, their chatter filling the air with youthful energy. When the first stars appeared, George guided them gently, showing them constellations, pointing out the bright glimmer of Venus, then finally positioning the telescope for Saturn. Each gasp, each laugh of disbelief, felt like fuel to him. They crowded around, eager for a turn, snapping pictures, asking questions about space, rockets, even Elon Musk. George found himself telling stories, not only of planets but of persistence, of how Musk had faced ridicule yet changed the world anyway. They said rockets couldn't land, George explained, but he didn't listen. He kept trying. That's what it takes. You don't quit just because people can't see what you see. The kids listened, wide-eyed, and George realized his voice carried more weight than he thought. When the night ended, they thanked him with genuine gratitude, some even hugging him before leaving. As the last of them disappeared down the street, George stood under the stars, his heart brimming. For the first time in decades, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself. The spark was spreading. Over the following weeks, word continued to travel. More kids showed up, sometimes with parents curious to see what the fuss was about. George's backyard, once silent and lonely, now hummed with life on clear nights. He set up lawn chairs, prepared extra cocoa, and made a routine of guiding groups through the heavens. The telescope, once a symbol of neglect, became a beacon of connection. Yet even as joy grew, challenges followed. One evening Michael called, his tone clipped. "Dad, I heard you've been hosting groups of kids at your place. Is that safe? I mean, strangers in your backyard?" George took a deep breath. "They're not strangers, Michael. They're neighbors, friends of neighbors. It's community." Michael muttered, "It just sounds unusual. People might talk." George's patience thinned. "Let them talk. For once in my life, people are talking about something worth hearing." Michael sighed heavily. "I just don't want you to get hurt. Or taken advantage of." George's voice softened. "Son, for years I sat alone, invisible. Now people come here and see the stars, and for a moment they believe in something bigger. That's not being taken advantage of. That's being alive." Silence stretched before Michael said quietly, "I guess I don't understand." George replied, "That's okay. Maybe one day you will." After the call, George sat in his garage, hands resting on the telescope, and felt the old sting of doubt creep in. But then he remembered the cheers from SpaceX's control room, the collective joy when the impossible became reality. Not everyone understood Musk either, until they saw the rocket land. Perhaps Michael needed to see for himself. Meanwhile, Emily surprised him with a visit. She arrived on a Friday evening, carrying a pie in her hands, her smile tentative. "Michael told me about your astronomy club," she teased. George laughed, hugging her warmly. Club might be too strong a word. But it's something. That night she stayed for stargazing, watching as children crowded around the telescope. When she peered through and saw Jupiter's moons, her eyes widened. "Oh my," she whispered. Turning to him, she added, "Dad, this is incredible. No wonder they love coming here." The pride in her voice melted something inside George. After the kids left, Emily lingered. "You know," she said softly, "I was worried when Mom passed, worried you'd never find light again. But seeing you out here tonight, it feels like she's here too, doesn't it?" George swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "Every night, Emily. Every single night." They stood in silence, looking up together, bound not by grief but by awe. From then on, Emily became his quiet ally, encouraging him, occasionally bringing her own children to join. The spark was spreading beyond the neighborhood, reaching family, touching hearts he thought closed forever. One particularly clear evening, a local reporter showed up, tipped off by a parent. She interviewed George, asking about his telescope, his passion, and the sudden popularity of his backyard gatherings. Nervous at first, George spoke simply, honestly. "I'm just an old man who didn't want to give up. Elon Musk showed me that impossible things can land if you keep trying. I figured, why not me? The article appeared in the local paper, accompanied by a photo of George pointing at the stars with a group of children gathered around. The headline read, "Local retiree inspires community with backyard space lessons." George laughed when he saw it, shaking his head at the absurdity. Yet deep down he felt proud. The boy who once dreamed of the stars had finally made a mark, even if only in a small town paper. The next morning during his walk, strangers greeted him warmly. "Morning, Star Man," one called. Another said, "Loved your article, George. Keep it up." Each word of encouragement built on the fire within him. He realized something profound. It wasn't just about him anymore. His small steps, his stubborn refusal to fade, had become fuel for others. The spark had spread, igniting hope in corners he couldn't have predicted. Yet the more visible he became, the louder the doubts from certain voices grew. At the diner one afternoon, two older men he'd known for years chuckled and said, "So, George, you think you're Elon Musk now? Better watch you don't burn out." Their laughter was good-natured but dismissive, and for a moment George felt the sting of being underestimated again. But this time, he didn't retreat. He looked them in the eye and said calmly, "No, I'm not Musk. I'm just me. And for the first time in a long time, that's enough." Their smiles faltered, and George walked out with his head high. That night he sat at his desk and wrote in his notebook, "The spark is not mine to keep. It belongs to anyone willing to believe again." He realized that spreading light meant enduring shadows too. Doubters would always exist, but they were only gatekeepers to breakthroughs. As he looked up at the night sky, stars shining like scattered diamonds, George felt the truth settle in his bones. He had begun this journey for himself, but it was no longer just his. He had become a living reminder that age was not the end, that imagination could outshine limitation. The spark had spread, and there was no stopping it now. The article had stirred more ripples than George anticipated, and though many of them were positive, there were undercurrents he could no longer ignore. Michael had not called since their tense conversation, and George could feel the distance stretching. The proud father in him wanted to believe that his son was simply busy, tied up with work or his own family, but deep down he knew better. The silence was deliberate. It gnawed at him during quiet mornings when the sun rose and the world felt too still, and it haunted him at night when even the stars could not distract him from the hollow ache of absence. One Friday afternoon, George sat at his kitchen table with the paper still folded from the article. He stared at his reflection in the dark coffee surface, and the thought struck him with painful clarity: it was not enough to inspire strangers if he could not reach his own son. He picked up the phone, fingers trembling slightly, and dialed Michael. The line rang too long before his son's voice answered, guarded and weary. "Hey, Dad." George cleared his throat. "Michael, I think we need to talk. Not about the telescope, not about the neighbors. About us." There was silence on the other end before Michael sighed. "I don't know what you want me to say." George's chest tightened. "Say what you feel. Even if it's anger. I can take it. But I can't take this silence anymore." Michael hesitated, then spoke slowly, his words like heavy stones. "I feel like you're making up for lost time with strangers instead of your family. You host all these kids, inspire all these people, but when I was a kid, you weren't there. You buried yourself in work, in books, in your own head. Now suddenly you're everybody's hero, but where was that when I needed it?" George's throat closed up. He wanted to defend himself, to say that he had worked to keep food on the table, that he had done his best. But deep down he knew Michael was right. He had chosen safety over presence, routine over connection. He had loved his children deeply but shown it poorly, hiding behind responsibilities instead of embracing moments. He whispered, "You're right, Michael. I wasn't there the way I should have been. And I can't change that. But I'm trying now. Not to erase the past, but to make something of the time I have left." Michael's voice cracked with restrained frustration. "Why now? Why after everything?" George swallowed. Because I finally saw that it's not too late. Elon Musk kept trying when people told him he was finished, when rockets blew up and the world mocked him. If he can refuse to quit, why should I quit on you? On us? There was silence, long and heavy. Finally Michael said, I don't know if I can just forget, Dad. But, maybe I can try. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door cracked open. George felt tears sting his eyes. That's all I ask, son. Just a chance. After the call, he sat in his living room, staring at the fading light outside. His chest felt bruised, but in the pain there was hope. Confronting the past had not destroyed him. It had hurt, yes, but it had also revealed something raw and real. For years he had feared Michael's words, but hearing them had been strangely liberating. The truth was out, and truth was always the first step toward healing. That weekend, Emily visited again with her children. She noticed the weight in George's expression as they sat on the porch after the kids went inside. Talk to Michael, she asked gently. George nodded. He's angry. He's right to be. I wasn't the father he needed. Emily placed a hand over his. Maybe not then. But you can be the father he needs now. People change, Dad. You've changed. Give him time to see it. George squeezed her hand, grateful for her steady presence. I just don't want to leave this world with that rift still between us. Emily smiled softly. Then don't. Keep showing up. Keep calling. Be patient. Rockets don't land on the first try. Her words struck him with almost prophetic weight, echoing Musk's perseverance. Rockets don't land on the first try. Neither do relationships. That night, George sat at his desk and wrote a letter to Michael. He poured out his heart with pen and paper, admitting his failures, acknowledging his son's hurt, and offering not excuses but honesty. He ended the letter with one simple line, I can't undo the past, but I can walk beside you into the future if you'll let me. He mailed it the next morning, his chest lighter though uncertainty remained. As days turned into weeks, George focused on his backyard gatherings, but the thought of Michael hovered in his mind. Every smile he drew from a child, every look of wonder from a parent, reminded him of the smiles and wonder he had missed in his own son's childhood. It hurt, but it also fueled him. He would not miss the present. He would not let this second chance slip. Then, unexpectedly, Michael showed up. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky clear, the telescope ready for another small group. George was setting up chairs when he saw his son walking down the driveway, hands shoved in his pockets, face unreadable. George froze, breath catching. Michael. His son stopped, glanced around at the setup, then back at his father. I got your letter. George nodded slowly. Thank you for reading it. Michael shrugged, though his eyes betrayed the turmoil within. I figured I'd see for myself what all this is about. George motioned toward the telescope. Stay. Watch the stars with us. Michael hesitated, then stepped closer. When the kids arrived and the session began, George spoke as he always did, guiding them through constellations, sharing stories of exploration, resilience, and daring to dream. He noticed Michael watching him closely, not with the disdain he feared but with something softer, something like curiosity. When it came time to view Jupiter, George offered his son the first look. Michael leaned down, peered through the eyepiece, and gasped quietly. I see, the moons. They're real. George smiled gently. They've always been real, son. Sometimes we just forget to look. Michael lingered by his side as the night went on, occasionally helping to guide kids to the telescope, even answering a question or two. When the evening ended and the yard was empty, he turned to George. I still have a lot of anger. But tonight. I get it. Why this matters to you. Why you keep doing it. George's chest ached with hope. And maybe why it can matter to you too. Michael didn't answer directly, but he didn't leave either. They sat together in the backyard, looking up at the stars, the silence no longer heavy but companionable. George realized that confronting the past wasn't about erasing mistakes, it was about facing them, admitting them, and choosing to move forward anyway. Just like rockets that explode before they land, failure was not the end. It was part of the process. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing Musk's words in his memory, failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough. Life, George realized, was no different. Confronting the past was not failure. It was innovation. It was the hardest, most important work of all. George did not know what to expect after that night with Michael, but something had shifted, something subtle yet undeniable. His son had sat beside him without bitterness hardening every word, without walls barricading every glance. That alone was progress, fragile but real. Still, George sensed he needed more than backyard stargazing to hold his son's attention, to prove that his passion was not a fleeting distraction but something worthy of lasting respect. Fate, it seemed, had a way of rewarding persistence. A week later, George received an email from the local community center. The director had read the article about him in the newspaper and wondered if he would consider hosting an event for seniors and families, an evening under the stars, they called it. George stared at the screen for a long moment, his pulse quickening. Him. Speak in front of a crowd. For years, he had avoided attention, content to fade into background noise. But now, the opportunity shimmered like a rocket on the launch pad. He replied with a simple yes, though his hands shook as he typed. Preparation consumed the following days. George spent hours polishing his telescope, rehearsing explanations, even practicing in front of the mirror. He borrowed a projector from Emily so he could show images of space, and he wrote note cards with stories about Musk's reusable rockets, about human resilience, about the reminder that age was not the end but a frontier. The night of the event arrived, and George stood backstage at the community center auditorium, his heart hammering in his chest. Voices buzzed beyond the curtain, families and seniors filling the seats, children laughing, programs rustling. Emily appeared at his side, her hand squeezing his arm. You're going to do great, Dad. He managed a smile, though nerves tightened his throat. It's been a long time since anyone wanted to hear me speak. She looked at him with steady eyes. They don't just want to hear you. They need to. The introduction came quickly, the director's voice announcing him as, a man who proves it's never too late to dream. Applause followed, louder than George expected, and as he stepped onto the stage, he squinted into the lights, momentarily overwhelmed. But then he saw them, faces of children, parents, elderly couples, all waiting, all curious. And in the third row, Michael, sitting with his wife, watching intently. That sight steadied him. George began softly, telling the audience about his childhood dreams of space, about the years he had buried those dreams under the weight of responsibilities, and about the spark that returned when he saw Musk's rocket land on its tail against all odds. That moment taught me, he said, his voice gaining strength, that just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean it can't be done. Even if you've been told you're too old, too late, or too far gone, don't believe it. I'm 70, and I've just begun again. He guided them through constellations, showed projected images of Saturn and Jupiter he had captured, and explained how rockets that once were discarded like scrap metal could now be reused, lowering the cost of exploration and opening doors for generations to come. We are all reusable, George added, smiling. Our time, our energy, our dreams. They don't have to be wasted. We can land again. We can rise again. The audience leaned forward, children pointing, seniors nodding. Laughter rippled when he joked about fumbling with his glasses at the telescope, applause burst when he spoke of perseverance, and when he ended with the line, I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again, the entire room stood in ovation. George stood frozen, tears filling his eyes. He had not expected this. As he left the stage, Emily hugged him fiercely. "You were brilliant," she whispered. But the moment that mattered most came when Michael approached, his face unreadable at first. "Dad," he said slowly, "that was something else. I didn't know you had that in you." George chuckled nervously. "Neither did I." Michael's expression softened. "Maybe I've been too hard on you. Maybe I never gave you credit for trying now. Tonight. I was proud to be your son." The words hit George like a sunrise breaking over dark mountains. For so long he had waited, hungered, for that acknowledgement, and now it was here. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Michael. That means more than you know." After the event, the director thanked him profusely and asked if he would consider making it a regular program. George agreed, astonished at how quickly his quiet hobby was becoming something larger. The breakthrough was not just the applause, not just the article or the event, it was the realization that his story could matter, that his persistence could ripple outward, touching lives, bridging divides, even mending old wounds. In the weeks that followed, invitations multiplied. A nearby retirement home asked him to visit, then a local library requested a talk. Parents sent notes thanking him for inspiring their children. One even wrote, "My daughter now wants to study engineering because of your stories. Thank you for showing her that curiosity never expires." George read the letter 3 times, tears slipping down his cheeks. At night, he walked outside and looked up at the stars, whispering to his late wife, "Can you believe this? After all these years, it's happening." He felt her presence in the silence, imagined her smile shimmering in starlight. Yet even as his influence grew, George remained grounded. He still rose early for his morning walks, still brewed coffee at the kitchen table, still found comfort in quiet rituals. But beneath the ordinary, a current of purpose pulsed strong. He was no longer just filling days, he was fueling lives. The neighborhood saw him differently now too. Where once he had been the quiet widower with a cluttered garage, now children shouted greetings, adults stopped to ask about the next stargazing night, and teenagers who once mocked him now asked for advice. George accepted it all with humility, knowing that the true breakthrough was not fame or recognition but the rediscovery of worth. One evening, as he prepared his telescope for another gathering, Michael arrived unexpectedly, this time carrying a small box. "Thought you might like this," he said, handing it over. Inside was a new lens, gleaming and powerful, far beyond what George could have afforded. George's breath caught. "Michael, this is too much." His son shook his head. "You've earned it. Besides, I want to help. Maybe I can be part of this too." The simple statement nearly undid George. For years he had feared losing his son forever, yet here was Michael, not only watching but willing to join. Together they installed the lens, and when they looked through it, the rings of Saturn came into focus with breathtaking clarity. Michael whispered, "It's beautiful." George, his voice thick with emotion, replied, "So are second chances." That night, as they guided children through the telescope, father and son side by side, George realized that the true breakthrough was not in the stars above but in the bonds slowly rekindling here on Earth. He thought of Musk again, of rockets failing before they landed perfectly, of critics turning into believers, of dreams once dismissed becoming reality. George had found his landing. And though there would still be storms, still be doubts, the trajectory was clear. He was no longer a man fading quietly into age. He was a man breaking through, carrying not just himself but everyone willing to look up with him. George thought the breakthrough at the community center might be the peak, a once-in-a-lifetime moment he would treasure privately, but life had other plans. It began with a phone call from the local newspaper editor. "George, your story is one of the most read articles we've ever published. A regional station reached out, they'd like to do a short television piece on you. Would you be open to that?" George nearly dropped the receiver. Him, on television? The thought felt absurd, like asking an old farmer to suddenly command a spaceship. He stammered out a hesitant yes, though doubt gnawed at him. The day the TV crew arrived, George tidied the garage, polished the telescope, and even trimmed the hedge by the driveway. Emily teased him, saying, "You're fussing like Mom used to before guests came." He chuckled nervously but admitted he wanted things perfect. The crew was smaller than expected, just a young cameraman and a cheerful reporter named Jenna. She shook George's hand warmly. "We've heard so much about you. The man inspiring kids with stars, sounds like something America needs right now." The interview was casual, filmed in the backyard as George explained constellations to a group of neighborhood children who had come for the occasion. He spoke of his late wife, of loneliness, of how Elon Musk's determination had reminded him not to quit. "I saw that rocket land and thought, if he can do the impossible, maybe I can too. Maybe I'm not done yet." The cameraman zoomed in on his face, capturing the sincerity in his eyes. When the segment aired that evening, George sat with Emily and Michael's family, his palms sweaty, heart pounding. He watched himself on screen, heard his own words echo back in living rooms across the region. To his astonishment, the story was presented not as a quirky human interest piece but as something profound. The anchor closed with, "George Miller reminds us all that age is no barrier to dreaming big. Perhaps he is proof that it is never too late to look up." The phone began ringing almost immediately. Old friends from decades past, neighbors, even strangers who had seen the broadcast called to congratulate him. Letters arrived at his mailbox, handwritten notes from seniors who confessed they too had felt forgotten, irrelevant, but were now inspired to pursue long-abandoned passions. One man wrote, "I dusted off my old guitar after watching you. Thank you for reminding me music still matters." George read the letters aloud to Emily, tears running down his face. "I never thought I could touch people like this." She hugged him tightly. "You're touching them because you're honest, Dad. You're showing them what courage looks like." Then came the email that stunned him most, an invitation from a state university to speak at a public lecture on inspiration and science outreach. George stared at the message, convinced it must be a mistake. A 70-year-old retiree with no degree in astrophysics being asked to speak at a university? But the invitation was real, and Emily insisted he accept. "Dad, this is bigger than you now. You're carrying something that people need." The night of the lecture, George stood nervously in a grand hall packed with students, professors, and families. The university banner hung behind the stage, and bright lights beamed down. When introduced as a community leader and symbol of perseverance, he almost laughed at the grandiosity. But when he stepped to the podium and saw eager faces waiting, he steadied himself. He spoke not with jargon but with heart. "I am not a scientist. I am not an engineer. I am simply a man who refused to stop looking up." He shared the story of Musk's rockets, not as technical marvels but as metaphors for resilience. He described how failure preceded success, how critics preceded believers, and how dreams, no matter how delayed, could still launch. The students applauded, parents nodded, and professors approached him afterward, thanking him for reminding them why they had chosen their fields in the first place. George left the hall dazed, humbled by the realization that his small story had leaped into a wider world. The ripple grew. A video clip of his lecture circulated online, shared by students and eventually picked up by a larger news outlet. 70-year-old inspires next generation with stars and second chances, the headline read. His phone buzzed constantly with messages. Some were from reporters, others from people simply thanking him. One evening, scrolling through the flood of emails, George stopped on a message with the subject line, "From a friend of Elon Musk." His pulse quickened as he clicked. The message was brief but astonishing. "Mr. Miller, your story has reached some of us at SpaceX. Elon hasn't seen it yet, but we thought he might like to. With your permission, we'd like to send him a copy of the lecture." George sat back, stunned into silence. The idea that his words might reach the man whose vision had sparked his transformation felt surreal. Emily found him frozen at the table and asked what was wrong. When he showed her the email, she gasped, covering her mouth. "Dad, that's incredible. Can you imagine? Elon Musk hearing your story?" George shook his head in disbelief. "I'm just a man with a telescope in his backyard. Why would he care?" Emily smiled knowingly. "Because you're proof of what he believes, that impossible things are possible. You're living his message." He gave his consent, though part of him doubted it would lead anywhere. But within days another email arrived, this one marked with an unfamiliar address. It contained only a single line: "George, keep looking up. The stars belong to everyone. Elon." George read it over and over, his hands trembling. It was not elaborate, not detailed, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that his journey, his small act of refusing to fade, had echoed all the way to the man who first lit the spark. He printed the email and framed it, hanging it above his desk where the telescope sat polished and ready. The neighborhood children gawked when he showed them, their admiration swelling. "You're basically friends with Elon Musk now," one exclaimed. George laughed but felt a quiet truth within. No, he wasn't Musk's friend, but he was part of the same story, the same thread of daring to dream against time and doubt. His world widened further. Invitations came from nearby cities, libraries, even a science museum that wanted him to lead a special Night with the Stars program. Reporters tagged along, capturing images of seniors and children standing side by side under George's guidance, their faces lit with wonder. One headline declared, "From Widow to Star Guide, How One Man's Second Act is Inspiring America." The phrase stuck in George's mind, his second act. It no longer felt like borrowed time but like a brand new stage of life. Still, he remained humble, grounding himself in routine, refusing to let the attention swell his pride. After each event, he returned home to his quiet house, brewed tea, and wrote in his notebook. "It is not about fame," he reminded himself. "It is about faith, faith that life does not end until it ends." Michael noticed the change too. At a family dinner, he admitted, "Dad, I used to think you were chasing something childish. But now I see, you're teaching. You're building something that matters. I respect that." George's eyes watered at the word respect, so long absent from their conversations. He reached across the table, squeezing his son's hand. "That's all I ever wanted, Michael. For you to know I'm trying." The bond between them strengthened, slow and imperfect but real. The wider world might have been taking notice, but for George, the truest breakthrough was still this fragile rebuilding of family. One late night, as he stood alone in his backyard after a particularly successful event at the Science Museum, George gazed at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Elon. Thank you for showing me it wasn't too late." But even as he gave thanks, he realized something vital. Elon Musk had been the spark, but the fire was his own. It had been his choice to rise, his courage to confront the past, his persistence to keep showing up. The wider world noticed because he had first dared to notice himself. And that, perhaps, was the greatest discovery of all. At first, George believed the wider world's embrace would be entirely uplifting, a warm current carrying him forward. The letters, the invitations, the email from Elon Musk himself. It all felt like a dream come true, a confirmation that his life still mattered. But as quickly as the tide had risen, so too did darker currents appear. It began subtly, with online comments. One evening, Emily showed him a video recording of his university lecture that had been uploaded to social media. It had thousands of views and countless positive remarks, but nestled among them were barbs. "Another old man trying to stay relevant," one wrote. "This is just a sob story, not inspiration." Another sneered, "He's no scientist. Why should anyone care what he says about space?" George laughed it off at first, but late that night, lying in bed, the words replayed in his mind. He wondered if they were right. What business did he have speaking on subjects he'd never studied formally? Perhaps he was nothing more than a curiosity, a sentimental distraction. The next morning, his doubts grew when a local journalist published a column questioning whether George's sudden fame was deserved. "Are we so desperate for feel-good stories," the writer asked, "that we glorify hobbyists while ignoring true experts?" George folded the paper with shaking hands. Emily noticed his distress and said firmly, "Dad, they don't know you. They're protecting their pride. You're not competing with scientists, you're inspiring people to dream. That matters." But George struggled to accept her reassurance. He felt exposed, as though every mistake or misstep might be amplified for all to see. His self-doubt, long dormant, returned with cruel force. At the next community event, he stumbled over his words, distracted by the fear of being judged. A man in the crowd asked a technical question about planetary orbits, and George, unable to answer, felt humiliated. That night, he confessed to Michael, "Maybe I should stop. Maybe this has gone too far. I was content with the kids in the neighborhood, but now I feel like a fraud." Michael, who once had been the most skeptical, surprised him with unexpected firmness. "Dad, you're not a fraud. You never claimed to be a scientist. You're honest about who you are, a man who found new purpose. That's enough. If people want technical details, they can read a textbook. What you give them is something no textbook can, hope." George listened, tears brimming. "But what if I fail them?" Michael leaned forward. "Then you fail honestly. And failing honestly is better than never trying." Those words lingered. Still, George's confidence wavered. A breaking point came when he received an invitation to speak at a national science conference as part of a panel on public engagement. When he told Emily, she clapped her hands with excitement, but George felt dread. A national conference? Surrounded by professionals? I'll look like a fool. Yet something inside pushed him not to decline. He remembered Elon's email, "Keep looking up." He decided he would try, though fear gnawed at him. The day of the conference, he traveled to the city, his old suit freshly pressed, his notes carefully written on index cards. The convention center was enormous, filled with banners, booths, and swarms of academics in polished attire. George felt like a fish out of water, clutching his worn briefcase as though it might anchor him. On the stage, the other panelists introduced themselves, professors with long lists of degrees, authors of books, heads of research institutes. When it was George's turn, he cleared his throat and said simply, "My name is George Miller. I am 70 years old. I am not a scientist. I am a grandfather, a widower, and a man who refused to stop looking up at the stars." Some in the audience nodded with warmth, but others crossed their arms, skeptical. As the panel progressed, the academics discussed strategies for communication, outreach programs, data analysis. When George was asked how he approached engagement, he paused, his heart racing, then spoke with quiet conviction. "I tell people the truth, that I was lonely, that I thought my life was over, and that a rocket landing on a barge made me believe again. I don't teach equations. I teach wonder. And sometimes, wonder is what opens the door for everything else." For a moment, silence hung. Then, unexpectedly, applause erupted, not from everyone, but from enough to remind George that his voice mattered. Later, in the hallway, a young graduate student approached him. "Mr. Miller, my grandmother has been so sad since my grandfather died. I showed her your story, and it gave her hope. Please don't stop. People like her need people like you." George's doubts softened. But the critics did not disappear. Articles continued to question his place in these spaces. Some online voices grew harsher, mocking his age, his lack of formal training. One even wrote, "This is why society fails, because we idolize amateurs instead of experts." George tried not to read them, but occasionally he couldn't resist, and the sting lingered. One evening, sitting alone in the backyard, he whispered, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am just an old man clinging to scraps of meaning." The stars above gave no answer, only their silent glow. Then Emily joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She placed one in his hands and said softly, "Dad, I've been thinking. The critics are loud, but they're not the whole world. You can't measure your worth by their noise. You measure it by the faces of the kids who look through your telescope, by the letters from people who find courage because of you. You measure it by the life you've reclaimed." George sipped the tea, warmth spreading through him. "But it hurts, Emily. I thought finding purpose would feel only good. I didn't expect the weight of doubt." Emily touched his arm gently. "That's because it's real. Real things always carry weight. But that doesn't make them less worth carrying." Slowly, George began to rebuild his resolve. He decided he would not hide from criticism but accept it as part of the journey. He realized that if even Elon Musk, with all his brilliance and achievements, endured constant ridicule, then surely a retired widower would face it too. And perhaps that was the deeper lesson, to persist not in spite of doubt but through it. At the next neighborhood gathering, George addressed the children directly. "I want you all to know something," he said. "When you chase a dream, people will doubt you. They'll say you're not qualified, that you don't belong. But you belong as long as you keep trying. I'm proof of that. Don't let the noise stop you." The children nodded solemnly, and George saw in their eyes the very thing he needed for himself, belief. That night, writing in his notebook, he penned a new mantra: "Criticism is the shadow cast by light. If there were no light, there would be no shadow. Therefore, keep shining." Slowly, he learned to balance praise with criticism, neither swelling too high from the one nor sinking too low from the other. It was not easy, every new headline or online post tested his resolve, but with Emily and Michael's support, and with the community he had built, he found footing again. In time, George began to see critics not as enemies but as reminders of authenticity. Their doubts forced him to stay true, to keep his message clear, to never pretend to be something he wasn't. And in a strange way, he grew thankful for them. Without doubt, there could be no courage. And without courage, his story would be empty. George had long imagined what it might feel like to stand near the place where rockets rose toward the heavens, but when the invitation finally arrived, it seemed almost too good to be true. The email came one quiet morning, subject line simple: SpaceX tour invitation. He blinked at the screen, certain his eyes were deceiving him, then opened it and read the words aloud, his voice trembling. "Dear Mr. Miller, we would be honored if you would join us for a private tour of our facilities and witness an upcoming launch. Your story has inspired many here at SpaceX, and we believe meeting you in person would be a privilege." He stared at the message for a long moment before calling out, "Emily. Michael." They hurried into the room, and he handed them the laptop, unable to speak. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. "Dad, they want you to go to SpaceX." Michael shook his head, smiling in disbelief. "You're going to see it up close, Dad. Not just on TV. The real thing." George sat back in his chair, his heart pounding, a strange mixture of joy and fear flooding him. "Do you think they really mean it?" Emily squeezed his shoulder. "They wouldn't have written if they didn't. You've come this far, now you're going to see where the future is being built." The weeks leading up to the trip were filled with anticipation. George prepared carefully, buying a new notebook to record every detail, polishing the shoes he had not worn in years, and packing with the care of someone embarking on a sacred pilgrimage. The night before departure, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering his younger self lying in the grass with Linda, watching the Perseids streak across the summer sky. Back then, the stars had felt so impossibly far, their brilliance unreachable. Now, somehow, he was about to walk among the people who were bringing humanity closer to them. At dawn, he boarded a plane with Emily at his side. Michael had wanted to come, but his work schedule kept him behind. "Take good notes for me," he had said. George promised he would. As the plane lifted from the runway, George gazed out the window at the shrinking landscape below. He whispered to himself, "Keep looking up." When they landed in California, a car awaited them, marked only with a discreet SpaceX logo. George felt like a child stepping into a world he had only read about. The drive carried them past sprawling freeways until the unmistakable silhouette of the SpaceX headquarters appeared. Glass, steel, and the towering presence of rocket stages standing like monuments to human will. As the car stopped, George's breath caught. "Emily," he murmured, "we're here." They were greeted at the entrance by a young engineer who introduced herself as Sophia. "Mr. Miller, welcome. We're so honored to have you." George shook her hand, his voice nearly failing him. "Please, call me George." Sophia smiled. "Then you must call me Sophia. I'll be your guide today." She led them through the entrance, where the air seemed to hum with energy. Engineers walked briskly, laptops in hand, conversations flowing about thrust, trajectories, algorithms. George felt small among them, yet deeply alive. They passed glass walls behind which technicians assembled engines, sparks flying, hands steady. "This is the Merlin line," Sophia explained. "The engines that lift Falcon 9 into the sky." George pressed his palm lightly against the glass, tears stinging his eyes. "They look like works of art," he whispered. Sophia nodded. "They are." They continued through corridors lined with models and photographs, early prototypes, test flights, explosions, and triumphs. George stopped before an image of the first successful Falcon 9 landing, the rocket poised proudly on its barge. "That's the one," he said softly. "That's the one that woke me up." Sophia looked at him curiously. "You mean the one that inspired your story?" George nodded. "I was alone, watching it on my television. When I saw that rocket land, I realized, maybe it wasn't too late for me to rise again too." Sophia's eyes glistened. "You have no idea how much it means for us to hear that. Sometimes we're buried in equations, lost in the grind. To know it reached someone's heart, it reminds us why we do this." They walked onward, into the cavernous factory floor. Massive stages lay horizontal, engineers climbing ladders to inspect them, welders at work, robots moving with mechanical precision. George craned his neck, overwhelmed by scale. "It's like a cathedral," he murmured. Emily smiled, watching her father with pride. "A cathedral built for the future." Finally, Sophia led them to a conference room where a surprise awaited. As they entered, George froze. Sitting at the head of the table, casual in a black shirt, was Elon Musk himself. George's knees nearly buckled. "Mr. Musk," he stammered, I never thought." Elon stood, extending his hand. "George Miller. I'm glad you came. I've heard a lot about you." Their hands met, and George felt a surge of electricity, not from Elon's fame but from his presence. The calm intensity, the sense of a man carrying the weight of the impossible yet refusing to bend. "It's an honor, sir," George managed. Elon shook his head. "No, George. The honor's mine. People like you remind us that what we're doing matters beyond the spreadsheets and milestones. You remind us that space is about humanity, not just rockets." George swallowed hard, tears threatening. "You gave me back my life." Elon's gaze softened. "No. You gave yourself back your life. We just lit the spark." They spoke for half an hour, Elon asking George about his journey, his community events, the children who now dreamed of stars because of him. At one point, George confessed, "Sometimes the criticism gets to me. They say I don't belong, that I'm not qualified." Elon leaned back, expression thoughtful. "People told me reusable rockets were impossible. They said electric cars would never work. Criticism is just the background noise of progress. Ignore it. The only qualification that matters is that you care enough not to quit." George nodded, engraving the words into his soul. Later, Sophia escorted them outside to the launch viewing area. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Before them, the Falcon 9 stood tall, a white pillar against the horizon. George's heart thudded as he took in the sight. "It's beautiful," he whispered. As the countdown began, the crowd hushed. George held Emily's hand tightly, every nerve alive. T-10, 9, 8, the engines roared to life, a thunder that shook the ground, the air, the very bones in George's chest. Flame and smoke billowed as the rocket lifted, rising higher, defying gravity's pull. George's eyes widened, reflecting fire and sky. "Go," he breathed. "Go." The Falcon soared, a streak of brilliance carving the heavens. Minutes later, the first stage began its descent. George held his breath as the rocket steadied, engines firing in calculated bursts. Then, with impossible grace, it touched down on the barge far out at sea. The crowd erupted in cheers. George's knees gave way, and he sank to the ground, overcome. Emily knelt beside him, worried. "Dad, are you all right?" He laughed through tears. "More than all right. I've just seen the future. And I've seen my own." That night, back at the hotel, George opened his notebook and began to write furiously. He wrote of fire and steel, of human daring, of the silence between stars. He wrote of Linda, imagining her smile as she watched with him from some unseen place. And at the end, he wrote a single sentence: "Today, I touched the edge of forever." He closed the notebook and lay back, exhausted but radiant. Tomorrow he would return home, back to the modest telescope and the neighborhood children, back to the critics and the doubts. But tonight, he carried within him the roar of engines and the image of a rocket rising, landing, rising again, a reminder that no matter the age, the dream was always within reach. When George returned from California, the small town that had once seemed so ordinary greeted him like a hero coming home from war. He stepped off the plane with Emily by his side, the notebook tucked under his arm like a treasure chest, his heart still reverberating with the roar of rocket engines. Waiting at the airport was not only Michael but also several neighbors who had followed his journey online, holding up signs that read, "Welcome back, Space Grandpa," and "Keep looking up." George laughed, embarrassed but deeply moved. "I'm just George," he protested weakly, but inside he felt a pride he had not known in decades. That night, back in his familiar home, he sat on the porch with his children, telling them everything: the engineers, the tour, Elon's handshake, the thunder of liftoff. Michael leaned forward, eyes shining. "Dad, you have to share this with everyone. This isn't just your story anymore, it's ours." George nodded slowly, realizing his son was right. The experience had been too powerful to keep private. It demanded to be shared, not as a boast but as a beacon. And so, with Emily's help, he organized a community event at the town hall. He expected a handful of locals to come, maybe the children and their parents, but when the evening arrived, the hall was overflowing. People stood in the back, crowded the aisles, even listened from the doorway. George stood at the podium, palms sweating, notebook open before him. He began haltingly, then with growing confidence, describing the sights, the sounds, the sheer magnitude of the launch. "When that rocket lifted," he said, "it wasn't just metal and fuel rising. It was us. All of us. Proof that impossible things can be done if we dare to try." The audience was silent, hanging on his words. Then, when he described meeting Elon Musk and hearing him say that caring was qualification enough, a ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. By the end, as George read the final line he had written, "Today, I touched the edge of forever," the room erupted in applause. People stood, cheering, clapping, some even crying. George lowered his head, overwhelmed. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own dreams. A retired teacher said she wanted to start painting again. A single mother said she had been afraid to go back to school, but now she would. A teenage boy whispered, I want to work for SpaceX one day. George drove home that night in silence, humbled by the realization that his story had become more than his own. It was a spark lighting fires in others. In the weeks that followed, momentum grew. The children in the neighborhood begged for more telescope nights, so George and Michael expanded the gatherings into a weekly club. Soon it was more than stargazing. They built model rockets, read books about astronomy, even video-called with local professors who were astonished by the enthusiasm. Parents began to attend, too, bringing food, helping organize. What had begun as a lonely man's backyard project blossomed into a town-wide movement. Emily suggested they give it a name. After some debate, the children voted to call it the Horizon Club. George loved it. Because we're all reaching for what's just beyond sight, he explained. The Horizon Club soon outgrew George's yard. The town council offered them the use of a vacant lot, and volunteers helped build a modest observatory, nothing grand, just a small dome with a larger donated telescope. On the night they unveiled it, George cut the ribbon with trembling hands as the crowd cheered. Looking up through the lens, he saw the rings of Saturn glowing with impossible clarity, and he whispered, "Linda, can you see this?" But the growth didn't stop there. News of the Horizon Club spread to neighboring towns, then to the state. Local newspapers ran stories with headlines like, "Retired Grandfather Sparks Space Movement," and, "The Town That Looks Up." Schools invited George to speak, and though his knees ached and his voice sometimes faltered, he accepted every invitation, determined not to waste the time he had been given. One afternoon, a bus arrived carrying children from a nearby city, many of them from struggling neighborhoods. Their wide eyes and eager questions reminded George of his younger self, yearning for something beyond the ordinary. He showed them the telescope, told them about the rockets, and ended with his favorite line, "You are never too old, or too young, to matter." That night, Emily found him sitting quietly in the observatory, staring at the telescope as though it were a holy relic. "Dad," she said softly, "do you see what you've built?" George shook his head. "I didn't build this. They did. The people. The children. I just opened a door." But deep down, he knew he had become the hinge on which the door had swung open, and the realization filled him with both awe and responsibility. With growth, however, came challenges. Managing the Horizon Club was no small task. Funding was scarce, volunteers came and went, and not everyone in town was supportive. Some muttered that George was chasing vanity, that resources should go to practical causes instead of telescopes and rockets. At times, George felt the weight of their disapproval pressing on him. But then he would remember the faces of the children, lit with wonder as they peered through the telescope, and he would press on. To strengthen their footing, George began reaching out to larger organizations. To his amazement, one foundation offered a grant to expand the club's programs. Another donated equipment. SpaceX itself sent a box of merchandise and a personal note from Elon, "Keep inspiring, George. The horizon belongs to those who look beyond it." Holding that note in his hands, George felt renewed determination. The Horizon Club began offering workshops, science fairs, even summer camps. Parents who had once worried their kids were glued to screens now watched them build rockets, write essays about Mars, and draw constellations. Slowly, the community shifted. The town, once sleepy and inward-looking, began to see itself as part of something larger, a place where dreams were not just fantasies but seeds of change. And yet, amid the joy, George felt an ache. Sitting alone one night in the observatory, he whispered, "Linda, I wish you could see this. You always believed in me more than I believed in myself." The stars shimmered back, silent but somehow comforting. That night, he realized something profound. This movement, this rising tide of wonder, was not only for the living but also a way of honoring those who had gone before. It was his gift to Linda, to his lost years, to the child he had once been who thought dreams expired with age. By the time autumn came, the Horizon Club had become a fixture of the community. Newspapers now wrote about the space grandfather with admiration instead of skepticism. Schools reported higher interest in science. And George, though still modest, could not deny the truth. He had helped change not only his own life but the trajectory of his town. One evening, as he closed the observatory dome after another night of laughter and discovery, Michael clapped him on the back. "Dad, you've built something that will outlive you." George looked at his son, eyes misty. "That's all I ever wanted, to leave something that lasts." And in that moment, beneath a sky blazing with stars, he knew that the community had risen not just because of rockets or telescopes, but because one man had dared to rise first. For all the applause and headlines, for all the telescopes and laughter of children, George could not escape a truth that grew louder in his heart as the years pressed on. Time was still moving, and his body was still aging. The fire inside burned brighter than ever, but his joints ached more deeply, his breath grew shorter on walks, and sometimes, after long nights at the observatory, he found himself gripping the railing just to steady his legs. The Horizon Club was thriving, but George began to wonder, what would happen when he was gone? Would the momentum fade, the observatory gather dust, the children forget the lessons once whispered beneath the stars? Legacy, he realized, was more than leaving behind memories. It was ensuring the flame burned in others long after his hands could no longer tend it. One night, after a particularly large gathering, he sat in the empty hall where children had just launched paper rockets and parents had shared their dreams of college and careers for their kids. Emily found him sitting alone, staring at the mess of paper and glitter. "Dad, are you all right?" she asked. He sighed. "I'm proud, Emily. More than proud. But what happens when I'm not here? Will it all fade?" She knelt beside him, taking his hand. "Then we prepare. We make sure it doesn't depend on you alone." The thought lingered as he lay in bed that night. He dreamed of Linda again, standing at the edge of a rocket's flame, her voice barely audible through the roar, "Pass it on, George. Pass it on." The next day, he called a meeting with Michael and Emily. "It's time," he said. "We need to plan for the future. The Horizon Club can't just be George Miller's project. It has to belong to everyone." Michael nodded, serious. "You're right, Dad. We'll build a board, set up a trust, make sure it runs even if you're not at every meeting." Emily added, "We should train leaders, too. Young people who can carry it forward." George felt a weight lift. For so long, he had clung to the work as though it might slip away, but now he realized true legacy was about letting go, about planting seeds in other hands. He began inviting the older children to take on responsibilities, organizing events, teaching younger ones, managing schedules. He watched with pride as a shy girl named Hannah became the club's best presenter, her voice steady and clear as she explained the phases of the moon. A boy named Marcus, once quiet and withdrawn, built a model rocket that soared higher than any other, and the younger kids looked up to him as a mentor. George saw in them the future, and it filled him with both joy and sorrow. Joy, because the dream was alive. Sorrow, because he knew his role would one day fade. Yet even as he prepared for that inevitability, life reminded him of its fragility. One winter morning, he collapsed in the kitchen, his heart racing. Emily rushed him to the hospital, where doctors kept him overnight for tests. Lying in the sterile bed, machines beeping softly, George stared at the ceiling and thought, "Is this it? Is this how it ends?" He felt a pang of regret not for what he had done, but for what he had not yet finished. He thought of the children, of the observatory, of unfinished lessons. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Not yet. Please, not yet." When the doctor returned, the news was gentler than he feared, not a heart attack, but stress and exhaustion. "You need to slow down," the doctor advised. George chuckled weakly. "I've been slowing down my whole life. It was speeding up that saved me." But he agreed to rest, and in those quiet days he reflected more deeply than ever on legacy. He realized that while the Horizon Club was a piece of it, his true legacy would be the courage he had ignited in others, the courage to rise again when the world said it was too late. One evening, Emily sat by his bed, holding his hand. "Dad," she said softly, "do you know what your legacy already is? It's not just the telescope or the club. It's me. It's Michael. It's every person who found courage because of you. That's already permanent." George turned to her, eyes glistening. "I used to think legacy was a name on a building, a story in a book. But you're right. Legacy is people. Legacy is love that keeps working even when we're gone." When he returned home, weaker but determined, George addressed the Horizon Club. "My friends," he began, "I won't be here forever. None of us will. But the stars we look at, they've been burning for millions of years. They remind us that our job isn't to last forever, it's to shine while we're here, and to pass on the light." The room was silent, every face turned to him. Then Hannah raised her hand. "We'll keep it going, Mr. Miller. We promise." His heart swelled. He had once feared the silence of irrelevance, the quiet of fading away. Now he saw that silence would be filled with voices he had helped awaken. Yet even as he secured the club's future, George felt a deeper legacy question stirring, not just what he left for his town, but what he left for the wider world. He remembered standing beside Elon, hearing him speak of Mars, of humanity becoming multiplanetary. George had always thought of himself as a bystander, but now he wondered, could his small spark contribute to that grand dream? Could the Horizon Club, in its humble way, prepare children who might one day step onto other worlds? One evening, as he closed the observatory dome, he whispered to the night, "If even one of these kids walks on Mars, then I'll have lived forever." That thought became his new fuel. He began reaching out not just to local schools but to state programs, writing letters, sharing stories, encouraging leaders to see the value of inspiring older generations alongside younger ones. "It's not just children who need dreams," he wrote. "It's grandparents, too. If you show them they still matter, they will move mountains for the future." To his astonishment, responses came. A state senator praised his vision. A university invited him to collaborate on outreach. Even a national magazine published an article titled, "The Man Who Brought a Town to the Stars." George clipped the article, tucking it into his notebook beside his handwritten mantra, "Keep looking up." Yet he never let the attention swell his ego. He returned each week to the children, kneeling beside them as they aimed telescopes, reminding them gently, "You don't need to be famous to matter. You just need to care." As winter melted into spring, George felt a strange peace settle over him. He knew his time was finite, but he no longer feared it. Legacy was no longer a question but an answer written in countless lives, in laughter, in dreams planted. One night, Emily found him outside, gazing at the sky. "Thinking again?" she teased. George smiled. "Always. But tonight, I'm not thinking of what I'll leave. I'm thinking of what we've begun. And that's enough." She leaned against him, both of them staring upward. The stars shone down, ancient and silent, witnesses to the truth George had finally embraced. Legacy was not a monument carved in stone but a constellation of lives touched, each light carrying forward long after the source had dimmed. And as he whispered a quiet prayer to Linda, thanking her for the years they'd shared, George felt the universe whisper back, "Well done. Pass it on." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?